Welcome, dear viewers, to our show, Natural Medicine. Today we're talking about sugar and the not yet taken seriously risk of brain health. I'd like to discuss this in the upcoming episode with Dr. Petra Wiechel, who is here with us. See you in a moment. Welcome, dear Petra. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get down to business. It's about me having to take responsibility for my brain health. This invisible cloud that's hovering around us, how are we going to stop it? Are we going to be aware of it? Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, it's all something that scares us. What can we do to be sure that we're not exposed to this danger? What can you recommend to us?
The topic of brain health, also in old age, has to be taken into account many years before. Because if the brain is affected, it makes very unclear symptoms at first. I can't remember it that well anymore, I can't remember the name. I can't keep what I read 2 pages before. And all of these are things I don't want to talk about dementia yet, and I don't want to talk about Parkinson's or MS yet. But in the end, they are all diseases that have begun in our body. And a responsibility to keep this system, this part of us, from its plasticity, its unburdenedness, its functionality, its lower destruction, to keep it from having a potential for destruction, means that I can never get rid of the fact what I eat and drink. Because that's actually the biggest inflammatory trigger for our brain. In addition, of course, to the world we live in, and today mobile phone is present, and thus the fire accelerator for many processes. That's why it doesn't sometimes take 20 or 30 years and people get to us much faster. And when you talk about healthy nutrition or a conscious diet that protects the brain, then you have to say that carbohydrates are part of our lives. The brain is the part of us that is dependent on sugar, but the dose makes it poison. And a brain or a body that is overflowed with carbohydrates, as we experience it today, the whole question of grain, bread, pizza, potatoes, rice, all the hidden sugars in the sweet drinks, and the sugar industry is actually scrupulous in letting sugar be present everywhere. These are things that an organism cannot accept or communicate at all. Especially since sugar is not even needed as a very fast energy supplier. So today, humans used to be under a certain physical strain for 6 to 8 hours, because they didn't have a car, they had to walk, they had to move. And that has now been reduced to a very, very short time. He actually doesn't realize this fast energy supply of sugar. And whenever the sugar supply for the organism becomes too large, the program immediately evolves, that we have to create resources. And these resources include the conversion of sugar into fat, which is so-called binding tissue in the liver. The liver feels very responsible for converting this excess sugar for bad times. Or the body ensures that increasingly more is converted into fat. Sugar itself has an incredibly negative effect on our entire microflora. There are developments in fungi that need this environment. Candida.
Candida, yes, I was about to say. You just need to make a small slip once again and millions of new colonies of Candida are created. And that's a big generalized problem, the fungal stress on us, which of course competes with the healthy microflora and simply destroys a healthy microbiome. And today we are at a sugar consumption, maybe we are already at 55, at 60 kilos per head consumption per year. And neither is a stomach membrane adapted to it, also is it a serious addiction problem. It's not even 100 years old, we still have 2 teaspoons of coffee per year, I think.
Yes, the sugar can was in the closet. That means it was only used for birthdays or holidays. And that's really a very serious danger, especially the so-called insulin resistance. Of course, the body protects itself from this excess supply. And if the insulin can no longer dock to the cell, because the cell feels completely overwhelmed by this excess sugar, then it will run out empty in the future. That means it creates a nutrient base, which dramatically reduces the cell's energy output. And that's not a big problem for the heart, for the muscles, and for many cells, because they can also gain sugar from fats and protein. But there is already an organ in us that is dependent on this sugar. And if the insulin receptors, the insulin, dock to the cell, open the gates, then the sugar can be processed as a fast energy carrier for energy supply. If that happens in the brain and the insulin can't dock, then the brain cell can't produce energy either. And that's how a first, also difficult process begins, which will of course burden us in some way.
Let's stay with sugar for a moment. I'm a little surprised that practically no one takes responsibility for it. We have a sugar lobby that says, sugar is healthy, God knows, and it is promoted from all over the world with state contributions, and so on. And on the other hand, science says, through fairly clear results, that this high sugar consumption massively affects our health. And what does the doctor say about sugar to help a patient?
Nothing at all.
It's not a topic, is it?
It's really not a topic, because all the consequences of this diet, such as insulin resistance, for example, are not taken seriously in my terms. Because you can really treat insulin resistance. And you can also treat a diabetes that is no longer manageable. Today, we say that over 60 have a so-called type 2 diabetes. That means this type 2 diabetes is an insulin resistance diabetes. And do you know what we give people? Insulin.
Oh, yes, of course.
What a drama. Because this insulin doesn't improve insulin resistance at all. That means this hyperinsulism has a great drama on the whole metabolism problem. And what is even worse is that people are not really made aware of this in their care. On the contrary, they can now enjoy life as it is. They just have to inject a little more. Yes, and I feel that as really very irresponsible.
I say emergency medicine. I mean, it's okay to a certain extent, but the cause is actually completely different. And is treatable.
It is very treatable, and no one, has to have diabetes in old age. Yes, it's all a bit made up. And before such a diabetes is determined, I don't really notice anything for years. Because the high insulin production of sugar is always kept in check somewhere. Because when I eat sugar, glucose always appears in the blood. And insulin has to react to that. Insulin transports the sugar and brings it where it is needed. And now the person stays in his chair, now he's watching TV, now he's eating fruit in the evening and what do I know, and snacks. And so, of course, the high inflammation also quietly develops. Insulin resistance is created. And at some point type 3 diabetes also develops. That means we have a decrease in the mental strength. And of course that doesn't end today or tomorrow. But I'm 62 now, that I could still experience that you don't just pour such a clientele of older people with their wheat rolls, not even in hospitals the jam is enough for breakfast.
The cake in the afternoon.
It's incredible how we also medically, especially the nutrition in the hospitals, that has everything else to do with it than a cost, the strength, the energy, that has an effort to get people out of this phase somewhere, which is of course very possible. And the first thing I actually do with type 2 diabetics is to transfer them to a metabolism, to make them manageable, treat the insulin resistance, to get them off their insulin. That's the most important thing. But they're also somehow lured in there. And an insulin resistance has the consequence that the mitochondria simply don't work anymore. And that's already dramatic for our brain. The substitute for this insulin resistance in the brain would be galactose. Galactose is sugar, which now 3 to 5 times a day, a teaspoon in a cup of tea, should actually go beyond this insulin resistance and supply the brain cells with sufficient glucose.
That means all those people who are now a bit prone to forgetfulness or dementia patients, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, would it actually do them all good if they had 3 to 4 teaspoons of galactose a day?
Definitely. It doesn't hurt at all. And it's good for everyone who, in addition to their Parkinson's or their MS and so on, have already developed an insulin resistance, don't actually know it. And the whole question of neurotransmitters, which are always substances that quickly, I'll say, as neurotransmitters, transmit information that allows us to be determined in this spiritual vitality and in our sense of happiness and so on. These are all things that depend on the cell itself remaining in a great self-activity. And it is precisely at this point that one would actually reduce the vitality slowly through insulin resistance.
And all these, let's say, sugar junkies among us, they would actually find the transition easier if they had this sweet hunger with galactose.
Yes, exactly. Or that they just, let's say, this daily consumption. You have to get away from your addiction first. Or this I have to drink 3, if I drink an espresso, I need 2 spoons of sugar. So that's where it starts.
Galactose has not been approved in Switzerland for a long time. So now it exists, but only in pharmacies. I would definitely tell you, if you want to order it, take the pharmaceutical version of galactose. Because there is also very cheap stuff on the internet, which comes from China, which is anything but optimal. And we are not talking about that, but about the pharmaceutical one, which has proven effective. I would like to ask you a few questions or a few words about fruit sugar. Because I always hear many mothers who say, I buy the best for my child, and of course only with fruit sugar, because fruits are healthy. And this thinking is actually completely wrong again.
So ultimately, whether it is fruit sugar, multiple sugar, whether it is the starch, in the end there is always one thing in the blood, and that is glucose. And all fruits that have a very high glycemic index, they say, which show a lot of this fruit sugar and thus also a lot of glucose in the blood, are of course all fruits that are sweet. And this again is the consumption of sugar and overconsumption in the conversation. That doesn't mean at all that the apple is healthy. That doesn't mean that the whole berry fruit, the apricot, everything that has a healthy and lower glycemic index, is still considered a very conscious and healthy diet today. But you don't eat fruit in the afternoon, for example, from 4 o'clock. You don't eat it in the evening either. Because this fruit then, through the intestine and the regulation force of the intestine, is no longer metabolized as much as in the morning and simply remains in the intestine. It ferments, it will have full-bodied germs, the tendency to grow. And that's not good. But fruit is properly placed. And when I do sports, I can also eat a banana with a high glycemic index. And I can also eat my grapes in the summer. But I don't do that in the middle of the day. And I don't have in mind that I'm also burdening myself with sugar.
I mean, I probably can't eat that much. So when I drink it, I get healthy fruit juices. Where we can of course drink an incredible amount of fruit, up to a light liter of fruit juice. And that is of course also a danger. Can you tell me something about artificial sweeteners when we're talking about sugar?
Yes, that means artificial sweeteners. There are good sweeteners, like xylitol, for example. That's the birch sugar. That's not an artificial sweetener. But when you talk about artificial sweeteners, then we know today that the gastrointestinal tract is also tricked out. That means that insulin is also removed. So it's by far not the case that it's a stability of the blood sugar level. And what is of course the biggest scandal of all time, and we could maybe do an extra episode about it, is aspartame. So I still wonder if it's even on the market or sometimes on the hotels, these little gastrointestinal tract or something. And that of course also makes a dramatic. It's almost like dementia, really holes in the brain that are visible in the CT under a year-long use of aspartame. So it's really a huge scandal, which is still in gum. And you just have to read it. And where aspartame is in it, it really has to be disposed immediately.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Unbelievable that it is still politically accepted.
And approved, right? While a galactose has to wait 100 years for it to get an approval. And on the other hand, we have such things in circulation, in masses. And I mean, the enlightenment work of the people is not done at all yet. Most people buy it.
Yes, that's something that's already incredibly burdensome. And in the end, people with cola light and all those things have a feeling of confirmation of the healthy or the reduced. But they don't even know what they're doing on the other side for things themselves.
If we go from sugar to the brain again, so we know that we should reduce sugar as best we can and switch to galactose, then reduce carbohydrates, because that also produces sugar. Then we have a valuable pillar for a healthy brain development. And I assume now that we will still come to the gluten from the diet, right?
Well, gluten in the sense of glicidin, of course, also in its dramatic development over the years with an inflammatory or inflammatory late reaction to the intestine. And thus to transmit the inflammation to the brain via the vagus nerve. And on the vagus nerve, which stimulates the whole vegetative balance and the resources again and again, to have a significant negative impact. But the intestine itself, which is so strongly controlled by gluten, by grain, by all the fast food microwaves, today's preparation, the so-called leaky gut, the chronic inflammation of the intestinal mucosa and thus persistent permeability for all endotoxins, what is in the intestine, a parasite burden on bacterial burden, on fusel alcohol, on pesticides, herbicides, on heavy metals, light metals, on food additives, bisphenol A solvents. This gets into the blood through the leaky gut. And of course, this also has an impact on the brain. These are things that, in the context of a lower possibility of the blood-brain barrier, which, of course, is no longer this fixed barrier due to our whole mobile consumption behavior or WLAN, like people had it for millions of years, of course, also has an impact on the neuroinflammation, as it is called. And every chronic inflammation causes cell destruction. And these processes don't get better up there, if there is no care in the intestine, if inflammation doesn't regulate itself, if gluten is not taken out of the diet, if, due to my lack of defense in the intestine, also on lectins, which are, for example, protein structures that are contained in aubergines or nuts or tomatoes, which are like protective substances that are present in this fruit and vegetable, but which are also recognized and attacked by the immune system as an enemy. These are all things that you have to deal with to simply drive down the inflammatory character here, the developing histamine intolerance, the parasitosis in the intestine, that is, to detoxify the intestine again and again through bitter substances, through black walnuts, through mimosa pudica, through garlic enema once a month, through coffee enema. That means that this intestine is slowly maneuvering into a health, that it again makes the brain available as a first instance up there, which can also split all of this up nutrient-wise, which the brain needs for its care and daily course, and not also as, I don't know, waste deposition is a wrong word, but somewhere everything has to go. If the intestine is no longer able to do what it is actually tasked with, to exude again, to offer the body, and of course that also significantly burdens our brain.
I would like to go into 2 points in the last 5 minutes. One point is ammonia. I keep hearing that when the chair smells very strongly, that this ammonia also goes into the blood and then into the brain. I would like to know what the effects are. And B is all these heavy metal loads that we take to ourselves environmentally or also via nutrition, which also accumulates in the brain and is also suspected of Alzheimer's disease, brain diseases. How do I get that out again?
Yes, so first of all, ammonia is a very healthy and normal, not healthy, normal product in the protein metabolism. Our body doesn't really care whether it's animal or plant-based. In the end, the amino acids have to be broken down as building blocks in the intestine. And these building blocks now have two metabolism paths. One that now goes to the liver, and the liver now takes responsibility for the fact that the entire body is now supplied with enough protein. These are all the immune building blocks that are built up, the cells that are renewed, the hormones that are used. Everything is protein. And the other thing is that, of course, the energy path is now being made possible. We get our energy from protein. And there is a final product of metabolism, which is ammonia. And this ammonia, of course, has to be expelled again. That means this ammonia actually has to take the way out. And if ammonia is now used as a highly toxic gas, so I wonder if we have more colon carcinomas, we don't have thin larynx, we have more colon, then I wouldn't even be so unsure that it has anything to do with the high ammonia, because ammonia is highly toxic to the mucous membrane. But now this ammonia has to, if it can't leave the body, because the pH value of the thin larynx is 8.5, of the colon is 5.5 to 6.5. But now it's the case that the whole microflora and what we know today about the symbiosis of the microflora is very modest. But one thing we know is that the lactobacillus and bifidus bacteria are simply the guardians of a healthy flora, and with their strength also prevent the pH value from changing. It always has to be milk acid rich, and that, of course, other pathological germs get in the way. And if this pH value, however, regulates itself in a 2 basic environment above 6.5 to 7 to 7.5, then ammonia cannot be excreted. And then, of course, there is the danger of a leaky gut. And then there is the danger that ammonia immediately goes to the liver via the mucous membrane. And the liver has to make uric acid out of it, and the kidney is excreted via uric acid. And if, for example, there is a severe liver disease, that's the biggest fear, this coma that arises because the ammonia level in the body rises, because the liver can no longer afford this detoxification. And in the very small, in the very hidden, in the very quiet, these processes can of course also cause the brain to suffer from it in the long term. That's why you don't have to start up there and not start with the liver, but you have to optimize the protein consumption a bit. Protein consumption is the building block, but you have to optimize it and of course have the gut in view. And to the second question, toxins are absorbed and have to be disposed of. And any stress with aluminum, quicksilver, lead, gadolinium and everything we understand as metal toxicity is of course detoxified by the liver for the most part as the main recycling factory. And no detoxification can take place if the gut has an open barrier. No detoxification can occur if the brain barrier is open. And that's why it's very important before you even start a detoxification that you know about these processes, because many people fall for chelat infusions or they kick a mill that is supposed to enable the body to bind toxins in a cruel, also health-related deterioration. That's why it's very important to first create the prerequisites for such a process in your own responsibility. And what is already a very urgent problem of detoxification is the question of the inospherosis for a few years now. And at the moment it's not important how my own detoxification capacity is, because it all goes outside the body. And of course I give this process a certain possibility of relief. And of course I have to support it.
So the big difference between chelat and inospherosis is that the process is inside me. Active detoxification and healing must be provided for. And on the other hand, it's outside.
Right. And I still have to catch up with such an inospherosis well, because I'm going through processes, of course, and the body can't do it from left to right. That's why we always find it important that there are only 24 to 28 hours in between, that the second follows, that I really detoxify. But these are processes that can also be continued with good chelat therapy, or before you start a good chelat therapy, very important prerequisites must be given for this.
What about coriander? You hear a lot about coriander detoxification.
Yes, but never immediately, but first start the processes in advance, to clear up, to build up the detoxification, to drive up the mineralization. And then coriander has its place at a later point, because it naturally supports brain detoxification immensely. But the body would never detoxify the brain immediately, but the body itself first intends to relieve the connective tissue, then to relieve the organs. And toxins are stored in the prostate, in the liver, in the thyroid, in the kidneys, in the huge space of the connective tissue. That's the whole intercellular space, intracellular, and of course also in the brain. And that's not its primary task, to activate relief immediately there.
You just mentioned a few important organs. And these organs are often also in the focus of disease patterns. Would the cause here possibly also be the stress of the corresponding organs with heavy metals?
Yes, of course.
So would it be a start again where you have to say, get the stuff out and give the organ a chance to regulate?
Of course, and we already have the possibility to measure stress today. We can't measure it here and we can't measure it there and there. But that's just the knowledge. That's also the observation. That's when I just do chelat, for example, how the liver itself also begins to relieve, how it naturally gets better and better into a possibility tomorrow, to regulate things much better for the body.
I've lost track of time, but still another question. A story you told me about a woman who had dementia and who also had the inespheresis. I mean, these are stories. Tell us briefly, because it fits so nicely. How quickly can a miracle happen sometimes?
Yes, we can also do a brain pheresis due to the inespheresis. And we know today, for example, that toxicity plays a very big role, especially in dementia. And it was incredible how after one and then after the second, how this activity, how this participating in life, how this language rearticulating was possible. That was, and I wouldn't underline that, we were all incredibly touched that this would be the case with everyone. But it made me aware of how valuable such a possibility of therapy is.
Not to exclude and not to be satisfied with the situation. There are always these miracles that can simply happen if you take the right note. So, dear Petra, thank you very much for this show, where we talk about sugar, about gluten, about this plant. What are these plants called?
Lectins.
Lectins, exactly. Up to the stress we absorb from the environment. All of this affects our brain, especially the sugar. I mean, these are things that we can easily get a grip of. We've heard galactose several times today as a substitute for sugar. Please get informed at a pharmacy and just ask for it. It's not cheap, I'm already warning you about it. You won't buy 53 kilos of sugar with galactose. It's extremely expensive, but it's extremely healthy, as we were allowed to learn today. So, that's it for today. I wish you all the best, see you next time and take care. Bye.